Okay. I've lost my window. Sorry. Okay. Welcome everybody to the 2021 New Orleans Poetry Festival. I'm Bill Lavender from the NOPF board. Before we get started, we wanted to thank our major sponsors this year, the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation and the Academy of American Poets, who've helped us keep this year's fest free and open to all. We're glad to see you with us this evening, and I hope to see you at the many other events that are coming up throughout the month of April. All you have to do is go to nolapoetry.com and check out our calendar and click on an event to join it. So with that, this session is ordering your manuscript, and now I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy Reed to introduce the panelists.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to the New Orleans Poetry Festival. We're really excited to be here. Today, we've got 4 different editors who will be talking about ordering your manuscript, trends and tips that they've learned editing and being writers themselves. So first up, we're going to have Samantha Edmonds, the author of the chapbooks Pretty to Think So and The Space Poet. Her fiction has appeared in such journals as Ninth Letter, Michigan Quarterly Review, Mississippi Review, Black Warrior Review, Indiana Review, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency, among others. Her nonfiction's been published or is forthcoming in Gay Magazine, The Rumpus, Literary Hub, Plowshares, Vice, Bustle, and more. Currently, she interns at the Missouri Review and works as the assistant fiction editor for Sundress Publications, as well as the fiction editor for Doubleback Review. She's formerly served as the fiction editor for Grist, a journal of the literary arts, and is the community outreach director for Sundress Academy for the Arts. She holds an MA from the University of Cincinnati and an MFA from the University of Tennessee. Originally from Ohio, she now lives in Columbia, Missouri, where she's a PhD candidate in fiction at the University of Missouri. Then after that, we will have Saba Syed Razvi, who is the author of the Elgin Award-nominated collection In the Crocodile Gardens and the collection Heliophobia, which appeared on the preliminary ballot for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in Poetry, as well as the chapbooks Limerence and Lux of The Divining and the Dead and Beside the Musin's Call and Beyond the Harem's Veil. She's currently an assistant professor of English and creative writing at the University of Houston in Victoria, Texas, where in addition to working on scholarly research on interfaces between contemporary poetry and science and on gender and sexuality and speculative and horror literature and pop culture, she's writing new poems and fiction. Her work explores topics such as mysticism, mythology, magic, interfaces between science and poetry, robots, religion, nightmares and dreams, transgression, sexuality and gender, culture and subculture, and the psyche. Then we'll have me. I'm Jeremy Michael Reed. I hold a PhD in English and creative writing from the University of Tennessee, where I was the editor-in-chief of Grist, a journal of the literary arts, and assistant to now U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. My poems and essays are published or forthcoming in Still the Journal, Valparaiso Poetry Review, Western Humanities Review, and elsewhere, including the anthology Mountains Piled Upon Mountains, Appalachian Nature Writing in the Anthropocene. I'm an associate editor for Sundress Publications in poetry and assistant professor of English for Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. And then last will be Erin Elizabeth Smith, who is the creative director at Sundress Academy for the Arts and the managing editor of Sundress Publications in the Wardrobe. She's the author of 2 full-length collections, actually now 3, right? And the editor of 2 anthologies. Her poems have appeared in numerous journals, including Ecotone, Mid-American, Crab Orchard Review, Cimarron Review, and Willow Springs, among others. She teaches in the English department at the University of Tennessee, and in 2017, she was inducted into the East Tennessee Writers Hall of Fame. So thanks everyone for being here, and we'll turn it over to Sam first.
Thanks, Jeremy, and hi, everyone. It is awesome to be here with you all tonight. Looking forward to the next time that we're all in New Orleans this time around. So I want to start off today talking about thinking about ordering your manuscript sort of after it's been drafted and you're ready to send it out, but before it's been picked up by a publisher or looked at by like contest editors and things like that. And then I think the rest of my panel mates have advice for other stages of the writing. So if there's one thing that you hear and then you hear nothing else, I think it's that you're going to rearrange the order of your manuscript a dozen times, especially when you're drafting and submitting. So none of these decisions I think are super permanent, but I received some advice when I was writing my chapbooks and more importantly, my story collection. But I think this is true also for poetry, especially a collection of poetry of standalone essays, right? Distinct from a project book that follows an arc. And we can talk about that too. But if you have a collection of standalone pieces of poetry that fit thematically, but perhaps are not telling a chronological order, this is the advice that I was given. And it's that the order your manuscript is in for submitting to contests or open reading periods is not necessarily your book order. The same way that like your dissertation or your thesis, right, is not necessarily also your book. And I do think that some of my panel mates will give you conflicting advice, and I'm excited to talk about that. But for my money, the things that you should consider when you're ordering a manuscript for submission are not necessarily the same considerations that you will make when your book is going to be published, for a couple of different reasons. For publication, you might think about balancing and building momentum and like narrative journeys or thematic journeys. And those things are really, really important. And you might have, at this stage, when you're ready to send it out, you probably already have an idea of how you want your book to go. But when you're submitting it to publication, you should front load the hell out of your work. That's my advice, my 2 cents. And this is especially true, as I said, if your pieces are standalone. If they're connected in a serialized way where chronology matters, right, you should ignore everything that I'm saying because it wouldn't make sense to put like the end of your book first. But I'm saying this thing about front loading because I've been an editor for a lot of magazines, a lot of publishers, a lot of contests. I've been an editor and a reader. And especially this is true for readers. You know, by the 40th manuscript or so in a contest, the readers they're smart, they're interested, they care, but they're also like dangerously catatonic. And there's really no way to avoid that, you know, with these kind of contests, and this is important work. But they're looking to see if something shakes them awake. I once had an editor say to me, and this is shocking, and this is not how I feel as an editor, but I've heard it said by editors, which is that like they're looking for reasons to like say no, right? They're like, okay, not this one, next, right? And like when it's really made simple for them in that way, it's sort of a relief because they can move on. And so I want every writer that crosses my path with this question about submission to think about what they can put in their manuscript that will shake that feeling away immediately, right? That feeling of like, I'm opening a new manuscript, I'm so tired. I really hope that this astounds me, but what if it doesn't, right? And you want, when they open your manuscript, you want your first piece to be your best shaker, right? The one that shakes them awake, that shakes them out of this like autopilot and makes them be like, wait, here's something. Because if you save your shaker piece, right, your best piece, your strongest piece for last, and I think a lot of people instinctually want to do that because they have this idea of like finishing strong. It's sometimes like, it's likely to get overlooked or skimmed through. And I don't even necessarily mean that a reader might not ever, like never get to the end. But I mean that by page 25 of a 55-page poetry manuscript, that reader pretty much knows if they're going to say yes or no. And sometimes that last awesome piece at the end is not enough to change their minds. But if they had read it first, they would have experienced the rest of the book differently. So I think that it's vital to sort of front load your pieces in the submission process, right? Like take your 5 favorite poems, take your, you know, your few strongest poems and put those up front in a way that maybe you would want to space them out in the final piece, in a final publication. And the only other thing I would like to add to that is that another reason why I think this is important isn't just because you're trying to like shake awake readers, but because the knowing that you're submitting something, even if it's not completely in the order that you think it would be in the final form, also makes you open to that relationship with an editor, right? So you've submitted it, you've won your contest, it's amazing, congratulations. And now your editor is going to have feedback, and your editor is going to be like, how would you feel about putting this piece 4 poems later? Or like, how would you feel about whatever? And the rest of the panel will talk about sort of what happens in the editorial process before your book becomes in the hands of a reader. So, but if you've got a submission order distinct from a publication order, that relationship can really, from post-submission, pre-publication, can really blossom like organically between you and your editor, instead of you holding firm to something that will be rearranged a bunch of times. So I think just sort of recognizing that your order of your manuscripts is going to change depending on your needs, right? It's going to be different when you're drafting versus when you're submitting versus when you're editing and publishing. And that makes sense to me, right? You have different needs and different goals and different stages of writing. So it also makes sense to me that you would have different orders. And I hope that saying this doesn't make you feel like helpless or like, oh, nothing matters, why try? Instead, I'm hoping that you're hearing like, well, if the order, you know, like nothing matters. So like, that takes the pressure off, right? Like let me, like, I can move forward from this because I know it's not permanent, is what I hope that you're hearing, and not, if it's not permanent, why am I working so hard? I don't want you to hear that. And then again, you know, once your manuscript has made it through a submission pile and it's accepted for publication, right? Then you would think about sort of nuances and visions for arcs and thematic journeys that you would like to see in a finished book. So that's my 2 cents, and I'm looking forward to seeing what others think. And I think Saba has some great activities for ordering.
Thanks, Samantha. That was really great. I liked hearing what you had to say about all of those things, but I'm going to start with something you said, and then that'll lead into something that I want to talk about. I think front loading is a really interesting strategy to think about when submitting to contests, especially when querying. But I think it's also interesting to think that different people read manuscripts in another way. So what you said about front loading, I thought about, but I also think about it in terms of pacing. So hopefully we'll be speaking to each other with regard to that. I wanted to talk primarily about the sort of broader aspect of putting together a manuscript and how we think about the elements of that manuscript in terms of curation specifically, right? So when we're putting together a project, when we're putting together a manuscript or a book, we have a lot of different things coming at us. And the first impulse for many people is just to think, I'm going to pick all the poems I wrote from the last thing I published until this one and just put them all together and hope they coalesce. And they seldom do, right? And we all know this, and we've all been through this, but when we're so close to a process, sometimes it's very difficult to separate yourself from that. So I hope what I have is just some ways to think about that process that might be useful and helpful, especially when we're putting together projects that either have been going out for submission and maybe not being not quite getting where they need to go, not being accepted or not being seen for what they are. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on how the material is working in the mind of the reader, how that material is reaching the reader in particular. So there's a back to basics kind of mentality that I think works when putting together any kind of project. So, you know, the internal architecture of your book, whatever it is, when it becomes a book, it's a manuscript, which is on its way to being a book, but it feels like a book, right? The internal architecture of that book is going to be really unique to what any of us are saying in that book and what we hope that people are going to experience out of the book itself. And of course, you've got the project a project that's conceived as a book, right? Which has an outside in kind of logic, right? We imagine the whole and then we build the poems to work within it. Or we imagine the whole and there's already a principle that kind of connects these elements together. So that automatically makes sense. That architecture kind of exists already. It sort of functions. But when you're putting together a collection of poems that didn't really emerge from the outside in, when there may be disparate things, different experiences that kind of work together, there's an interesting sort of synchronous revision of idea and concept and energy that goes into putting that book together, which sometimes changes the individual poems in addition to the whole project as a whole. So I think it's worth thinking about. It's not quite like line editing, right? You know, there's a different experience that happens when you're editing. And if we only think about the process of sequencing a manuscript, curating the poems in that manuscript as a kind of editing, it becomes a little bit limiting. And I think we lose some of that potential that's there. So when putting together a collection of poems that didn't start as a project or as a whole, it's not from the outside in, but the inside out. And that task doesn't involve creating a space to fit a particular design, but to see what emerges from the patterns that are already in front of you and working from those and making sense of them. For me, and I like to think in terms of like, oh, it's like this or it's like that, metaphors and similes. I'm very fond of these. So I'm going to throw a lot of them out there and maybe something will stick, right? So maybe something will appeal to you. I think of this a lot like a constellation, right? You've got stars, there's a whole lot of them. You don't want to connect all of them, right? Because that isn't going to work. So you have to be very deliberate in how you choose to connect the things that you're looking at, and sequencing and ordering an arrangement in a manuscript, all of which are slightly different but related, can do that for a particular book manuscript, in my opinion. When you're thinking about books designed as such, order and sequence are really significant, right? Sequence keeps us moving in terms of that energy. But when collected into a book manuscript and from disparate parts, order and arrangement start to make a lot more sense. You want to think about how they work together. So order and sequencing, if you try to think of the process as a sequence specifically, one thing, then another, then another, then another, there's a path. And that's in conversation with other poems and with the concept of time and the passing of time, especially how we experience the poems that are coming across. Then there's also the option of breaking things up into sections or subsections, right? And once we start breaking things up into sections and subsections, you've got little groups of things that are moved one place to another. You're in conversation with the conceptual frameworks that are underpinning that collection, which becomes really important if you want a cohesive project. If you have epigraphs or other references, poems in response to or in conversation with other works, you've still got that conversation, but that conversation brings in a bigger picture approach and therefore needs to be organized tightly so that what we want to highlight gets highlighted and it doesn't feel haphazard. Because what we don't want is to just seem like, oh, it's anything that I could think of just thrown into the mix. And finally, when we want to curate these concepts, not finally for the talk, but finally for this element, when we're curating these different concepts, we want to think a little bit about the overall effect that we hope to achieve with the project. Not knowing what that effect is and simply reacting from the end of one poem to the beginning of the next, that becomes a little bit limiting unless you're working very specifically to make something happen with that, right? Some people read books from start to finish in one sitting. Some people read books from start to finish over a long period of time. Some people hop around. So when I'm looking at a project, if I'm screening for a press or if I'm judging for a contest, I don't always just look at the first 10 pages. That's why I hope I'm in conversation with the front loading. I do look at the first 10 pages, but then I sort of flip to the end. So the first few pages matter, the last few pages matter, and the very middle matters, right? So for me, I look at the first poem, I look at the last poem, I go right to the middle. Because a lot of poets will put the stuff they're not so sure about, which feels murky, kind of in the middle. We're all guilty of it, right? Because we know the beginning has to rock, the end has to shake your world. And the middle, well, we're all going through it, right? And so the middle, I think it has to be something that we can grab onto and hold onto. And keeping in mind that people will hop around sometimes in reading a project means that we have to be careful what we're hiding and how. So when curating and creating a structure, if sequence matters, if order matters, if chronology matters, or if you want to highlight certain things, sections are going to be really important. Because if you don't, people will react from poem to poem to poem to poem. That's sometimes a thing that works for people. I brought a few things I'm just going to show you guys, and then I'll flip on. This is Ascend Ascend by Janica Stuckey. I don't know if you guys know him. He's an interesting poet, and this book is sort of structured like a retreat. So it's based on ideas of Jewish mysticism specifically, and it focuses on the idea of a retreat. And the entire book is structured like the Tree of Life in an interesting sort of manner. So you've got all these little elements. Each one of these sections is meant to ascend. That's kind of its goal. And in terms of the poems themselves, they start out small, they end bigger because they're meant to accumulate as you keep reading. And that's very much something that he's doing with his work in terms of pacing and what he hopes to bring about. This book is by Roger Siddharth. It's called Ghazal Games. And he has a completely different perspective on how he's arranged this kind of stuff. There's internal sequencing throughout. We've got things like Ghazal Game number 7, Tic-Tac-Toe, which means obviously there's 1 through 6 before it somewhere in the book. And then, 8 through 10 and whatnot afterwards in the book. A lot of these things then create an internal structure that moves us around without discreetly making sections like this one here. So we have different ways of creating stuff to hold on to. This is a chapbook, or this is a book. It started as a chapbook and then it became a book later, Sim Sum by Sabrina Ora Mark, and it's fantastic. I recommend it. And one of the things that I love about this is that you have these recurring themes. And so there's certain characters, Walter B and Beatrice are two of the main characters in this collection, and they just show up. So there's things like Walter B needs some time. Beatrice takes a lover. Beatrice writes a letter to a magazine. Then we have Walter B in some other places too. Walter B's extraordinary cousin arrives for a visit. So we're tethering then the experience and movement like this in terms of an internal sequencing order, but also like this because it's in stages. It's broken up into 10 different pieces. So these can work in conjunction with each other. If you're working with letters, the idea of the sequence is automatic or automatically going to be responding from one to the other. So we have Dear Regime, again by Roger Siddharth, who I just mentioned, and then The Master Letters by Lucy Brock-Broido. So in poems like these, the conversation is really crucial. So you are going to be looking at pairings, who says what, how it's received, who says what, how it's received. So the connection between poems is particularly relevant and important. When you're looking at things like Four Cities by Hala Alian, you're looking at geography and geography in terms of spaces. So it's little thematic sections that are contained in this collection. Ab Ovo deals with the concept of many things, but takes the notion of gestation and the time of gestation as one of the elements of ordering the poems that are in there. Cephalopodic by J.P. Dancing Bear takes into account ideas of desire and how it waxes and wanes, and that determines kind of the internal logic of that book. And then you have Yearling, which talks about a process of becoming familiar with something that's not familiar. So intimacy, the increase of intimacy throughout, that's really at the heart of how these are connected. Blizzard does something very similar. We begin with something really small, a little haiku that invites us into the character of the lizard. And then later poems go on to sort of have a conversation or say something about that lizard or that particular character. That determines what's going to go first and what's going to go later in that particular project. So there are activities that you can do if you're trying to make sense of your poems and what you want to do with your own workshop, with your own manuscript. Imagine a playlist. Imagine that your poems are a playlist and think about how each idea connects to the next, right? Or if you can't quite get there, think about what songs come to your mind as you're listening to your poems or reading your poems, and make a playlist. And then, is that the mood you want, right? Is that the mood you want to create? Is that the experience that you want? Or just imagine the constellation of themes or images across your pages. Now for me, I love to like print them out and put them all over a big long wall and then look at them. And I'll take highlighters in different colors and say, okay, this particular, like every time I encounter love and desire, right? We're going to make that pink. And anytime we encounter like misery or despair, we're going to make that blue or whatever, right? And anytime we encounter something like defeat, that's going to be a different color. So I just kind of mark up my entire manuscript, and then I look at the color to see what kind of energetic motion is happening for us? What is the emotional journey that we're experiencing in terms of theme? And you can use that process of ratiocination to look at all those different elements in conjunction by putting everything out there on a wall or on like a poster board or something like that. You can also imagine the hero or heroine's journey and map out which of those poems fit into that. If you've got a more narrative arc working or different characters, Thomas and Beulah by Rita Dove does that really well, and it's worth thinking about how that works together. And then imagine energetic motion and line length. That's another thing you want to think about. If you put everything all in one go, sequencing lets you see what's going on in terms of the balance. Do you have all of yours? Is it all top heavy? Like, we want to front load the stuff that has the most impact in the beginning and at the end. But if all your short poems are at the beginning and all your long poems are at the end, that's building a certain kind of momentum. If it's the other way, that's creating a different kind of momentum. And we have to see what makes sense for the particular book. And finally, we all think about things like gimmick. Gimmick is important as we sort of invoke what we want in a project and how to order it. But we don't want to overdo the gimmick, because then that's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be an enjoyable experience. You want to trust your instinct. You want to be deliberate. And you want to think that not every poem fits into every manuscript. So be fair. Kick some out. They're not gone forever. They can go to a different party, right? We can put them in there somewhere else. And, chronology of composition, that's irrelevant unless you're doing something with your particular life journey. So I would recommend, while putting together a manuscript, try 2 to 3 different options. See what that does for your poems. See what that does for your organization before you send things out to manuscripts, or in the process of it, so you can see what works and what doesn't with your particular readers. I hope some of those ideas work with you guys, and I hope they're interesting to you. I like to read the table of contents, first poem, last poem in the middle. So if you're sending to anything where I'm reading, make sure those rock, right? Okay, thanks. Jeremy, I think you're up next.
Yeah, thanks. This is so great. I'm looking forward to talking to everybody at the end. So I'm taking the kind of approach of, as an editor, how do I read kind of this piece that I'm trying to work toward publication, right? What are the steps and questions that I ask myself as I'm thinking as an editor? But then I was thinking, as I was writing this up, that it's also the stuff that I try to do in my own writing as I'm trying to revise and make my own projects better, right? So from either point of view, I think it could be like a pulling of side of the curtain almost, but also to help us with our own projects. Awesome. So one of the things I was thinking about is that there's a ton of different options for what collections can look like. And so whether that's a collection like a greatest hits album, or like something really narratively coherent, like a memoir in verse or a novella in verse, something that's really stylistically consistent. So all prose poems, all sonnets, all free verse, no poem that's the same. Or a lot of collections that include other art or artifacts or stories to like include them directly or respond to them or write over them or something. All of those kind of make me think of the writer asking this question of what can a manuscript be? And it's really exciting, right? But an editor has a more particular question, and we all have to put kind of the editor hat on for ourselves of what is this manuscript? And what is this one trying to be, or what can this one be? And as a writer, I find those editor questions helpful, but sometimes hard to get myself to ask openly and honestly of my own work. So hopefully showing you all the questions that I ask will help us all put our editor hats on a little bit more easily. Throughout all of these, so there's kind of, I've organized it with 4 different readings or type of readings that I give. But through all of them, the abiding question for me is, what structuring elements can we find already in the manuscript? And how can they be used to best further what the book's trying to be or say, right? So what's already there that we could use better? So the first type of reading is kind of like reading from 20,000 feet. And it's part of what Saba was starting to talk about there too, where you look at the larger structures to figure out what this book looks like. I usually start out in the table of contents. So I ask myself, how's the book broken up into sections or not? How could that structure the narrative? Is it one long story? Is it a diptych, a triptych, a sequence? What does that look like? I also ask, what are the poem titles and how are they structured? What kind of a mix of poem title structures do you have, and what tone do the answers to those title questions set for the book as a way to think about what this book might be as I head into it. And then I also flip through either physically if I print it out, or I zoom out on the document and look at just what the shapes of the poems are. What do they look like on the page? Are they all similar? Are they all short lyrics, all short lined, left aligned? Are they ranging across the page the whole way through as I flip past? Whatever shapes or forms are present, do their uniformity or diversity set up a certain expectation? Are there moments where that pattern's broken? And then based on all of those choices, kind of in this pre-reading, who do you think of as the voice behind this project? What are they like? A sound experimenter, a narrative crafter, an image-rich painter, a language tinkerer? Who is that person? So then on a second read, this is where I sit down and I'm just a reader, right? I like to read the book, especially if I know that I want to spend some more time with this book. I just sit down and try to read it in one sitting. I'm one of those people. So I read it from beginning to end and ask myself, what's the experience of reading this book? And here's a few questions for that stage. At the beginning, what kind of a book is set up for the reader? Are the opening poems not just strong, but do they develop a story, or are they not interested in stories? Are there 3 airplane poems in a row making me think this is an airplane book? Does it stay an airplane book as you keep going? If there's a trend or an approach primarily happening, where does it deviate? Where does the narrative or tone take a direction I wasn't expecting? You can keep asking yourself whether the book does that in a way you can use or in a way that interrupts the momentum, but you should mark those sections regardless and keep reading the book. Are there poems that seem to be sister poems or in conversation with each other or saying similar things as each other, even if they're not next to each other? You can keep thinking about whether the relationship is an element you can use or just too repetitive, but you should mark those. Think about each section if it has sections. What does each section accomplish as a unit? Is there a progression from one to the next? Does each section mirror the others in form or narrative progression? Is there a section that stands out as different, and where does that one get to be? And what does its trajectory look like? How does it change what the book feels like? And so whether it's more of a collection or a project book, I think manuscripts that work well can usually answer the following question in just a sentence or two, which is, what's the story being told or the feeling being communicated in the book? And so if that sentence isn't clear in my mind, I make a note of that. If there are multiple options Venn diagramming each other, I write those down. I also always ask writers when I know I'm going to work with their book to pass along any poems they've cut from the manuscript over time. And as a last step to this reading, I read those. So ask yourself, do they fit into the sentence that I thought of for the book? Where could they go to help develop that sentence? And if nowhere, then good job. They don't belong there. Then the third reading is as an editor. And so this is where you kind of like get into the mud and the muck and mess around, right? You bring out all of your editing chops and put them to work. But you also have this larger context of the book story in mind because you just read it through as a reader first. So I read the manuscript again, but I focus primarily on the parts that trip me up, and either in tone or narrative, and thinking back to that second read, where in the manuscript is the sentence of the book not clear, right? Reorder what needs reordering, try things out, reread and try again. So if we think back to the airplane poem example, or 3 airplane poems at the start of the book, and that doesn't feel right. On this read, you've already seen what the manuscript contains, and you can ask yourself, should those be spread out? Should they be section leading poems, or one per section? Should more travel type poems be included so it's not all airplanes? Should some of the non-airplane poems use airplane language or metaphors to connect more fully, even though they're talking about something else? Should the poems be cut? Maybe they just don't work. And as you read through the whole manuscript, ask yourself the tried and true poem revising questions, right? Like the things we're all practicing all the time. What are my verbs? What are my main nouns? How do my line stanzas poems begin and end? What's the energizing moment or the heart of each poem? But then I ask myself, do my answers to those questions start to sound the same from one poem to the next? This may point to an over-reliance on certain words or types of endings or realizations or interjections as structuring elements. And if you use them too much, they can kind of dull in what they can do, right? And then my last way of reading is as a poet, right? So we've read it through, we're a more practiced poet. And we've done these earlier readings and edits, and we're a little bit better for it. But so this time I usually, once it's further in the process, read the manuscript out loud. I listen for sounds where my voice trips up in a way that deviates from the story that's trying to be told, and also listen for the parts that work. Can you rewrite the trip ups, and are the parts that work buried in a way that you might be able to unearth them? Listen for words repeated and ask yourself if they're repeated too frequently. Listen for interesting words. You wrote that one poem with tabula rasa in it, and it was a home run, and you definitely want to include it. But there's this other poem that you wrote 5 years ago with that word in it too, and that's in the book as well. As a reader, when you encounter those two poems and you see that repetition, you expect to be able to connect those two poems meaningfully. So look for those word or phrase repetitions, even if you didn't intend them originally, and ask, what do they need to be meaningful? Listen for sounds repeated too. What sounds typify your book? What do you fall into? And just be aware of that. How do you use it to your advantage and not let it be a sound version of the word body being used so many times that every time it comes up, you don't really pay attention to it. And then I also look through the manuscript and I read just like the first line or two of each poem and the last line or two of each poem. And just think about how did they lead or deviate meaningfully from one to the next. And you can ask the same about ends of sections, beginning of sections, and book beginnings and endings too. But I think we think of those more often than we think of poem to poem. So some last questions to ask. I usually think about writing that story or feeling of the book as a sentence again at the end and see if it's a different kind of sentence. Does the sentence make sense? What parts of the book does it leave out? Should they be left out of the book, or should they be further integrated into the story? What are the further poems you may need to write to flesh out the collection you have? So are there narrative or tonal holes to fill or bridges to build from one area to the next? Is there that one poem you've always thought of writing but haven't figured out how to? Do you want to give it another shot? What are ways to make something of the manuscript's current weaknesses? So if you use a word, sound, or structuring element a lot, could you make it into a self-aware element of the manuscript? What emotional, tonal, or narrative landscapes would approaching that inside the book open up? And then also, this is something that I feel like everyone's run into, but is there a direction you see opening up that feels a bit scary, that could change the trajectory of the book from what you originally thought of it as being? And try to treat that as exciting instead and write toward it a little bit and see what happens. You can always keep your older saved version and have it safe to go back to, right? But I think sometimes those kind of scary new openings are exciting and can change the way that the book is and make it a little bit more complex in a good way. So everyone's already said this, but every book goes through that process several times, but those are kind of the 4 steps that I think about. And when you feel like you need to go through those processes again, you start back over. But hopefully we can talk a little bit about how everyone approaches that, and good luck with your manuscripts too. I think Erin's up next.
Thank you all so much. This has been great, and so wonderful to hear everybody's different perspectives, and so much of the stuff that's been kind of like circling around in my head. I'm like, yes, that is a much smarter way to say it. So I want to come at this a little bit more from a editorial perspective. So I work with poets, usually sometimes between 4 and 6 poets a year, depending on working on manuscripts that we publish with Sundress. And I also read for all of the contests that we do. So I get kind of that perspective of kind of just, reading and trying to figure out what we're going to put out into the world, what stories we want to hear told, but also thinking about. So I want to start with arguing with Sam a little bit. We knew this was going to happen, and I have definitely seen books that do the front loading, and I think that works a little bit better maybe in fiction than it does in poetry, because if I read the first 10 poems and I'm like, fuck yeah, this is great, and then I get to poem 12 and I'm like, and it like takes a deep turn, I recognize immediately what that trick is, and so I am just as likely to say no if the first 10 poems are great than if like 2 of the first 10 poems are like knocking my socks off, because I can see like this is what's happening. So I think sometimes I'm wary, especially again in poetry manuscripts, where that becomes transparent, or if it's setting up, as Jeremy talked about, different expectations for the manuscript that it never fulfills. And I think so if you get into the beginning and you're like, whoa, 4 sonnets, man, these are masterful, and then like that's it, there's no more sonnets. I'm like, where is that expectation that is established? And I think it's not that you shouldn't have your good poems at the beginning. You absolutely should. And you know, I'll be honest, we've all hit places where we have read for stuff, and you know, we get through the first 10, and you're like, meh, and you skip, and you're like, oh, okay, and then you go back, or you skip and you're like, meh, and you like, you know, there's a space in that, so you do need to catch that attention early on. Like you don't want to backload all of the good poems either, and you need them throughout. But also, if it's a good manuscript, the whole manuscript should be slamming. So to some extent, I mean, certainly we have those filler poems that get us from one place to the other, but there needs to be that sense of like, you know, excitement in the work itself, like not just like, well, I wrote 50 poems, that's a manuscript. It's like, you know, it's usually more like I wrote 200 poems and now it's 50 poems and now it's a manuscript, maybe, who knows. So I think that a lot of that has to do with like thinking about the idea of when we first started Sundress, one of my fellow editors and I talked a little bit about the idea of a book as an album, not a collection of singles. That it needs to feel cohesive from start to beginning. And while I think I agree with you, Saba, in that we definitely pick up books and sometimes we flip through, and sometimes, and like in that process of reading, especially with manuscripts, I'm the same way. But for the most part, when we read poetry collections, we read them front to back. Right? You know, we read them like we would a novel. So there needs to be some sort of like cohesion from front to back. Like it needs to tell a story. Whether that story is chronological or not has nothing to do with like whether it's good, but it needs to begin somewhere, move, and do something and change. Like we should get to a new place at the end. And I think one of the things, you know, as Jeremy was talking about with expectation, I do think there's a notion of sometimes when we tell that story, there's a tendency that I find is people want to overtell that story. And I'm definitely guilty of that. Like my last book started I was like, look at these 82 pages. Like, oh God, no, don't ever turn in an 82-page manuscript of poetry. But I mean, I know people write them. It's a lot. So the first version was that, and then it dropped down to like 70, and then it dropped down to like 65. And I think the final version that I sent out was like 58, like, you know, pairing, because I felt like I was telling the same thing a lot. Like I was like, okay, cool, this is another perspective from this thing. Is this doing something new? And that's a problem that I see in a lot of really good, really tight manuscripts that are telling something front to back or telling something that's themed, is that there's an inclination to overtell. So I think figuring out, like, I love, Saba, your idea of color coding. I've definitely done that through manuscripts too. I was like, okay, this one fits into this theme and this one does this. And that doesn't mean like those are your sections. Like this is about love and this is about nature. Like you want them all to like fit together within that. And I think that is like it kind of doing that interweaving is the difficult part, but also thinking about like the consistency of the manuscript. One of the things that my thesis advisor, about way back when in my MFA, asked was how many yous are there in the poem, like you as in YOU, not sheep. That's a different collection from me specifically. So but that notion of who is the you here, who is the he, who is the she, who is, like, anytime that you're not naming somebody, there has to be kind of a consistency throughout it. One of my favorite examples of this was a friend of mine was working on a manuscript, and like one of the poems was the you was like the lover, And the next poem, the you was the grandma. And we were all very confused. So, because that is, you're like, what? This seems like a very strange shift, because you're going to read that you consistently throughout. And I think like that's one of the things that becomes really hard, especially if you're writing like about different people, or like at a certain point, you also have to think about like just leaning into conflating people. You know, it's like, it's fine if, you know, boyfriend number 2 and boyfriend number 5, you know, it's fine. Nobody, you don't have to stay true to the whole specific narrative. And I think like that kind of conflation really can be helpful in thinking about the big picture. This was also true in one of the earlier sundress manuscripts. Like sometimes the you was the wife, sometimes the you was like speaking to the reader, sometimes the you was like a father. And like I kept getting lost within the concept of like, what is this saying about that you? And I think that's a really an easy thing, because like when we write individual poems, we write them to different people, we write them about different people. But when that comes together, then we have to start thinking about what that narrative is. For me, all of my my books personally, and I will say honestly, as much as we want to talk about like all these different ways that we can order a book, I will say 80% of the books that I edit are chronological in some capacity, like because our lives are chronological. You know, we grow after we didn't grow. So like, you know, we go from one step to the next. So even though the entirety of the manuscript isn't like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, there is still a sense of chronology about it. Like the older poem, and it's not even necessarily older poems start with in that context, because we write backwards, we write in reflection, and those don't necessarily have to come in that same order. So I do think the easiest way, if you're going to say, I'm going to start putting my manuscript together of poetry, start it chronologically, see what happens within that. It's going to move around. And, you know, again, the first iteration is not going to be the last iteration, but I do think it's a good first step, and a good easy first step. And most of the times when I'm reading manuscripts, it's the step I ask them to go back and take if it's not already taken. So to kind of work within that context. So why are we learning about this character on page 40 when that character seemed also to be this you in this previous poem? Or was this the friend here? Like, I feel like there's this link here. So just say the thing to begin with and draw it back around. So I think that's one of the things that I tend to go back to a lot. In the same sense, within the context of kind of overwriting the idea, I'm going to pop a cool link into your chat. Jeremy mentioned using the same words over and over again, because we all have our obsessions, the things we go back to. This link you can cut and paste your entire manuscript into, and it'll tell you how many times you use each word. Let me tell you, I wrote the word porch a lot in my last manuscript because I was a smoker. So, and I'm like, this is where I'm having my deep thoughts. So yeah, so these sorts of moments, so like figuring out like, okay, what are the themes? This can be a space to also start on that. Like, where are your obsessions that are already there? And that can also help within that context too. Finally, I want to end with kind of like not a piece of advice, but like a downer bit of news. Not all presses are going to have an editorial process. Quite a few presses do not. You send a book and they say, sounds good. And that's that. I know at Sundress, we have a really robust editorial process. I know at some of the bigger presses they do, but certainly a lot of the smaller presses or chapbook presses, a lot of folks will just be like, okay, cool, that's good, we like it. And like, so you need to have that feedback and also push against that a little bit, because just because the book's been picked up doesn't mean it's in its final form. Like, that's the space in which to continue to move forward. So you're like, okay, great, you like these, let's give you a better version of this. Maybe it's pairing, maybe it's adding to, and like finding your friends and your community that you can exchange manuscripts with. That to me is the thing that is so important. I think we all think like, we're going to get a book picked up, we're going to work with an editor, the editor is going to be super in tune with what I do, and we're going to like pop out this awesome book over all these edits. And that's what I thought the process was going to look like. And it wasn't for me for any of my books with any of the presses I worked with. So it was very hands off. And I'm like, come on, please hurt me. Tell me it's not great. And it wasn't that way. So I think knowing that you can exchange a book with a friend, knowing that you have a community that you trust and that you admire, is always like the number one advice. Like, and like, because you're not always going to get the things that you think that the process is going to look like. So yeah, so I just, it's exciting. It's a fun thing. You basically, you get to shape all these tiny babies in one big baby. And it's really cool to put it out into the world and figure out the story that you're telling. I mean, it's some paging Dr. Freud shit at times, in terms of realizing like what it is that you're actually writing about or where those obsessions are. And that's a fun process too. So yeah, so I'm excited to hear everybody else's thoughts, questions they have, and thanks so much for joining us on this this Sunday evening.
Well, that was great, y'all. I will actually say something if I don't want to abuse my privilege as host to be able to interrupt, but and I don't want to interrupt, but a couple of thoughts arose as I was listening to this, and one is I realized when I read the topic of this roundtable that the notion of ordering a manuscript was like very important to me, like as I was sort of becoming a poet and trying to figure out what it meant to be a poet, that it was, I mean, I know it, in my first years, I wrote a lot of individual poems and struggled with the idea of how to order them. But what the conclusion I finally came to was that they really didn't deserve to be ordered, and that nothing that I could do in the way of ordering was going to save them. And then I sort of eased into doing, well, I was reading Jack Spicer, who has this whole philosophy of composition by book, and the notion of the serial poem, the notion that a poem is always a series, not only with your own work, but with the work of your peers. And so I began to experiment with longer forms, just basically creating a book length form and then sort of pouring the work into it and making it fit that. And I found this kind of formal constraint was extremely productive for me. And then with later books, I always, all my books since that time, when I was, I don't know, 30 or so, I've conceived the entire book before I started writing a single poem. And I'm not necessarily recommending that for anybody, but I guess what I'm saying is that this whole notion of ordering the manuscript goes in a way to the heart of what it means to be a poet, and sort of your relationship with the poetry as well as with the editor, and then it's just one last thing, and I'll shut up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be like take all this time, but as an editor, I find I get manuscripts of two sorts. Ones where the poet is absolutely adamant that it has to be precisely this way, and ones that are extremely flexible about the order of poems, and that will like say, well, if we just move this poem here, this 2-page poem will fall on a spread, and that'll look much better. And so we get into a lot of design things like that. But generally, just in response to what Aaron said about hands-off editors, I actually try to be hands-off because I feel like I just feel like I'm not really smart enough to engage in that sort of minutia of the manuscript with this, with a poet who's got like a subjective thing that's coming through this work, but there's also an objective force that's coming, let's say, from the culture or from elsewhere. And I don't usually want to argue with that, you know, and so I am a hands-off editor. I accept something or not, you know, and if I don't, it's always with trepidation, I guess. I mean, I don't review many manuscripts anymore because I find it so egregious to reject them. But anyway. So anyway, thanks for stirring up all these ideas, thoughts.
Yeah, and I do want to note, like, it's not that it's a bad thing, you know, with this is not a dig on you, or the process of like picking that. I think, you know, I understand that notion of like arguing. I like to think of it like as a conversation. Like, you know, the more that we like sit and chat with one another, the more we recognize about our own work. And I think like so often, like when I work with students on chapbooks that they're putting together, so much of that conversation is about like, you know, this is how I'm seeing it as a reader. And if that is not the intention, then maybe there's like other ways to think about that, to get that through. And it's like, maybe I'm not the audience for that. And then obviously like that's a different sort of conversation too.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll add to that. I mean, I really like what you guys are saying with that. And I think there's an interesting sort of distance between reading for like some of our students and reading for people in contests or people in, you know, who are submitting their work, and where people are in their process can sometimes, in their stage, what stage people are at in their writing process, in their writing career, can sometimes be a bonus, but it can also sometimes be a drawback because it can make people a little bit more limited and closed in what they're doing. I always like to look at a manuscript and say, would I accept it as is? And if not, you know, then there has to be like a good reason for like my intervention. You know, I like to think a little bit about, I don't like to impose my vision very much. I like to have a lot of conversation about why did these choices happen? Can there be some explanation? So it's more maybe illuminating, but I think otherwise it becomes a bigger process for revision. When I oversee thesis projects for my students, when they're working on their master's projects, when they're putting together collections, and they're still finding their voice. So I think it becomes really, really important for them to think about that conversation in a way that imagines their book as part of the conversation of literature. Right. And I think in that space, you know, it needs to be more intimate, more direct, more intense. That sort of competitive aspect of the poet competing against his or herself, his or her own potential, becomes really important. And so the editorial voice becomes more of a aspect of guidance, I think, in that particular space as well. And I love the idea that design sometimes changes the book layout too, right? Sometimes you're just like, well, this is just awful in this place. You know, you get your galleys back and you're like, no, right? You know, and or someone who's working on your book says no, and you're like, yeah, I get it. You know, I agree. But you know, there's different levels of trust there too. So I like that question of how hands-on and hands-off people are as editors. My abrupt ending is not one that we want to use in a book. So Can I ask a question of my fellow co-panelists if no one else has anything yet? You know, do you guys have any like pet peeves in terms of looking at a book and how it's arranged? Or are there things that you gravitate towards as a reader when you're exploring stuff that you pick up?
Someone else go. I already talked.
You did. Well, it's also, I mean, it is 7. If you guys want to put a stop here, we can, unless, you know, anybody else has any questions or comments.
I don't know that I have any pet peeves to answer your question, Saba. Like, I think that I know that there are things that I'm better at editing than, or like that I might not be as good. Maybe this is a better way to put it, that I might not be the right editor to edit, right? And so I do like acknowledge those things and kind of pay attention to my own tendencies or things that I read, or whether I'm like familiar enough with the section of literature, like the way you were talking about, that the book will be in conversation with, to give good like readerly feedback, right? And so I'm really aware of that, but I don't know that I have like things that are rules against or something. I just know when I kind of get a little out of my depth in one direction or another because I'm not as familiar with it. Yeah. Annie?
Hi. I was just wanted to put out that I have read dozens, hundreds probably of collections, lots in the last year because I've had copious amounts of time for this and have wanted to support other poets. And I've been a student of poetry for quite a long time. I got to say that as I look through collections, and I'm working on something right now, and so I've been studying, looking at other people's collections, and I find it breathtakingly difficult to see what the guiding force was in putting manuscripts together. And I have lots of poet friends, and I've worked with them, and I've seen, and I'm thinking, I wonder, I can't actually glean from the finished product, what it was that prompted this before that, these together with, and so I'm just sort of, and I think of myself as a bear of at least average brain. So I think there may be a bit more mystery to this than, and I really appreciate this roundtable. It's fantastic. It's been interesting and potentially useful. But can you say in general whether it is clear to you, when you're looking at the first manuscript, this is organized according to a structure that is coherent and that sort of pulls the thing together in a way that makes it a finished product, as opposed to what you sort of the dreaded bunch of poems that somebody said belong together? Thanks.
I'll just jump in. I think that, sometimes you can tell very clearly what a poet is trying to do. And sometimes it's just a sense that you get, like a mood or a feeling. I think if it's overly directed and we can see too many of the puppet strings, we lose some of that joy, So I think if it's too obvious, it's not masterfully done, in my opinion, or it's got an artifice that is incredibly deliberate. So for me, it's, do I feel like it works in my journey as a reader for me, and what elements do I pick up on? And I don't think that two people are going to pick up on the same ordering elements necessarily.
Sorry, I think I have something to say, so I'm going to start talking and hope meaning follows. I like what Saba said too about like you don't want to see too much of the seams, but I think for me as an editor and reader, especially as a reader when I don't know the editorial process behind a book, if I'm just picking up a book for the first time, the larger sections might be like, I might understand why section 1 is section 1 and section 2 is section 2. And that to me is often enough to like make meaning, even if I don't understand why poem 4 is 4 and not like 6 or 7. And so I think sometimes like I can see like big picture stuff, and like the smaller picture stuff doesn't always. And truthfully, there might not always be like a oh, you know, like when you're naming your top 10 of something, right? Like your top 3 might always be your top 3, but then after that, why is 1 7 and why is 1 9? Maybe it doesn't matter. It just matters that they're in the top 10 and not the top 20. And so I think like individual poems side by side, sometimes like why aren't they flip-flopped could be less relevant than like why are they in this section and not section 2, and it's easier to glean meaning from those larger questions. And as an editor, sometimes it does feel like you said, Annie, like there's some mystery there. Like what I'll do when I'm working with a writer or even with my own work, right, I might read poem 3, 4, and 5, and then I'll read them as like 5, 3, 4, and they just don't seem to go as good. And there's really no reason why, but I'm like, that doesn't feel as good. So I'll switch them around, and there might not be a reason. And like, maybe the reader won't even know why. It's just like, when you try it both ways, you pick the way that feels the most natural. And I don't know that it's always like, well, this happened in September, this poem is September, and the next poem is October. Like, I don't know that it's always that cut and dry. Sometimes it is, I think, like you said, just sort of like a feeling, right? I tried to read it this way, and then I tried to read it that way, and I chose my favorite.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing within that context, and just kind of following up on something earlier, is like, for me, I take so much from fiction, from novels. Like, I feel like I should see change in a narrator. I feel like I should see change in growth or deterioration, whatever iteration. I want to see the I from the beginning of the book, whether that I is persona or whether that I is confessional, etc., to be somehow different and transformed by the end. And I think that for me, if I'm not seeing that, if it feels static in that way, that is a space where I feel like that there's more potential that could be done in ordering.
And I think some people like to look at that sense of movement, of time and progression of experience. Just on the other side of things, when I read novels, I expect that. When I read poetry, it's like, I'm looking at it from this angle, now I'm looking at it from that angle, now that one. Like, so I expect to feel like I have moved as a reader. So it's another way we can like maybe conceptually think about that sense of movement too. And, you know, I think that does feel mysterious in manuscripts. I like, if there's no mystery, why keep going? You know, so I agree that there should be some mystery in there, but that it should feel like there's a purpose for that mystery. So
I wonder if anybody could speak to sort of emergent properties in drafting the work. So something I've noticed sometimes is I'll say like, oh, I've made a couple of these. What if I made some more of them? Or, oh, these seem to kind of maybe go together, but they would need some more of that. What if I tried this? I wonder if that's something that you experience as well. So not like waiting till everything exists, but sort of along the process, starting to notice continuities and then make new work in response to that as you're developing it.
I do that all the time. I will get a certain number of poems that I like, I think this is a book, and then I'll like sit down and I'll put it in an order and then be like, where are the holes? And then maybe try and then do what I can to write towards those, not like with super intentionality, but being like, I've got 2 poems about airplanes. Maybe I should have 2 more poems about airplanes. Yeah.
I think that when we're writing individual poems, they work as one kind of thing. When you're looking at a conversation that happens by combining a lot of different poems, things do shift and change. So it's just like, you know, when you're putting paintings up on a wall in your house, right? You know, maybe something looks great, you acquire another piece and everything else kind of changes. And you're like, well, if I put this here, I move this there, now there's an open space. So what do I put in that space? You know, and you might go out and find something or commission something or paint something yourself to put there, you know? So I think there are those movements too. And I think that's one of the joys of being able to think about sequence and ordering, looking for places that you can add material, subtract material, highlight, spotlight, curated in different ways.
I think about a mobile sometimes, right? Like things need to balance. So there can be variety, but if there's only one of something, what else is evening it out on the other side so it doesn't get tippy?
I think too sometimes about that way that like if you notice the opening, right? Like how to write straight into it rather than trying to like figure out, I don't know, for me at least, there's a certain element of, you know, in one project that I was working on, there's several poems that are up to the community I grew up in, right? Or like including people from the community I grew up in as a community. And I was really uncertain about what to do about them. And then at some point just decided to write to them, right? Like as a letter, and try to get what I was trying to figure out. I was thinking about this earlier today when I was thinking about what we were going to talk about too, with like people who have words that appear over and over again. And I think often the tendency is to go back through and take a bunch of them out because they're overwhelming. But I also think about like, what would it be to make a poem that had so many versions of that it became like a new thing to work with, right? And I feel like that might relate to some of what you're talking about with form and tone as the way forward with those two, Bronwyn.
Okay, I want to say thanks to Jeremy and Saba and Samantha and Aaron for putting this on. It was great. And seen a lot of you at some of the previous events, and hope to see all of you at the ones that are coming down the pike. Oh, it's the Tilted House reading tomorrow. So please show up for that. That should be really fun. Thanks to all of you who came out as audience and everything else. And look forward to seeing you tomorrow.